Hi, I'm Adam Crespi, and welcome to the Autodesk 3ds Max Certification Exam Preparation. Here's just a little bit about me. I'm an Autodesk Certified Instructor, and I have been since 2004. I've also been an Autodesk Certification Evaluator since 2010. I'm a Senior CG Instructor at the Art Institute of Seattle, and I have over 20 years' experience in design visualization, animation, and games. I started out, believe it or not, in 3D Studio Release 1 for DOS and Maya 1 for Irix. In this AU virtual session, you'll explore the objectives for the Autodesk 3ds Max certification exams. The certification topics I'll cover include modeling, rigging and setup, animation, cameras, materials and shading, rendering, compositing, data management and interoperability, dynamics and simulation, effects, lighting, scripting, and user interface and object management. At the end of this class, you'll be able to use my tips and tricks to prepare for the exam. You'll prepare for the exam by reviewing the certification roadmap and mapping the learning objectives to the study materials. Here's an overview of the exam format. It's composed of simulation items, where you'll be asked to perform a particular task in the software and return an answer or change a value, for example. There are multiple choice questions, where you'll select the correct answer from a bank of possible answers. And finally, matching and hotspot or identification, where you'll be asked, for example, to identify a piece of the UI or point to a particular component of an object. So let's get started. We'll dive into user interface and scene management and get an overview of how to navigate around in 3ds Max. Here in 3ds Max, understanding the user interface, how to navigate the viewports, switch views, and how to display using different modes is key in any workflow. In this Art Deco train station, right now I'm in Shot 001 in Realistic Display Mode. I'm also using the scene lights and shadows to show the scene, and I can see the sun coming in through the windows. Additionally, I've maximized my view, so instead of 4 views I'm working in one large view, and I'm showing the safe frames on my viewport. I'll start out by looking at the viewport labeling and how to get around in the different views. Right now it says I'm in Shot 001 up here in the viewport label in the top left. I'll click on Shot 001 and here I can choose other views such as perspective, top, back, and right and left. I can also go to my cameras and choose cameras, and there's the 3 cameras I have in the scene. We can even set a view to be from one of the spotlights or the sun, and this allows us to aim that light at a particular object. I can use my hotkeys as well, pressing T for top, Z to zoom extents, and F3 for wireframe to change how I'm seeing my scene. Pressing L takes me to a left view, and P jumps into a perspective. Pressing C takes me back to a camera view. And if there's more than one camera in a scene, I can click from a list. Here's Shot 001 again, and I'm in a wireframe. I'll press F3 to transition back to realistic. 3ds Max's viewport is driven by the nitrous display, and it provides a terrific way to see our lighting and shade in the view, along with realistic materials. I'll click on realistic, and we can see here that I've got realistic display modes, shaded and consistent colors. I can turn on edged faces to see the wireframe of the object overlaid if I need. We also have different stylized display modes available if we'd like, and we have options for showing lighting and shadows. Switching to shaded, for example, shows the diffuse color of the material plus any specular highlight. Jumping over to clay then, shows me a red clay, which is great for modeling, for example, and lets you see just the contour of the object. Going under Stylize then allows us to see graphite, ink, color ink, and so on. Choosing ink, for example, shades the view as if it was an ink drawing, with stylized shading and line work on our objects. Under Lighting and Shadows then, we can configure what we're seeing just the default lights or the scene lights. Switching over to default lights in ink, for example, gives us a very dark gray render. Here in Shaded View, default lights give us a nice even color. Back in Realistic then, the default lights are shadowing and giving me large black areas in the scene. I'll switch back over to Illuminate with Scene Lights, and we can see under there as well that I can use shadows and ambient occlusion if needed. Turning off shadows then shows me just the full strength lighting in the scene. There's lots of different display modes here, and they allow us really to get in and see how things are going to look before we hit render. Or if we're working in games, for example, to see very close to how the objects will look in-game before they're taken over to a game engine. I can configure the viewport further if I need, going under Visual Style and Appearance in the configuration to start, and there's my display modes, default light choices, shadows, and so forth. This is also where I can access things like statistics to show poly count, turn off and on my view cubes, and even lay out regions. These allow me to deal with different regions in interactive rendering, for example. We can turn off and on our safe frames here, and set out the percentages in for things like action safe and title safe if we need. Once we understand how to get around the view, we can start working in Max. To select an object, simply click on it. Clicking on, for example, this main flooring plane, called Flooring Main Center 001, selects it. Pressing F4 to turn on edged faces shows me that selected objects have a white wireframe. I'll select a seating unit, for example. This seating cluster, number 6 here, is shown in bold type in the name field up in the top right of the screen. That denotes it as a group, and there's also nothing available in the modifier list, meaning that it is a bunch of different objects that are all grouped in here. Holding Control and clicking on another object allows us to select multiple objects, and now I can see there are 2 groups selected. Picking an object, holding Control and selecting another one, and then holding Alt lets me deselect one of the selected objects. When we've selected objects, we usually need to do things to them. Right now I'm in Select and Move, which I can get to by pressing W. What it shows me up here on the main toolbar is that my reference coordinate system is set to parent. I can switch back over to Screen, for example, and I can see that Y is up instead of Z. Here it is in View, and there's Z up, and also in my pivots I'm using the pivot point center, that is each object's local pivot. Flying out this pivot and choosing something else shows that pivot jumping, for example. I'll pick Use the Selection Center and select 2 objects here, and we can see that their pivot jumps in the middle. Now as you notice, when I select different objects, each one has its own pivot and own reference coordinate system. I'll fly out this button again and pick Use Selection Center, and we can see the Move tool jump over to the middle of those selected objects. It's important to understand where our selections think they are, where their pivots are, and which way those pivots are facing depending on what we need to do. This comes into play, for example, when we're rotating multiple objects or we're setting up a rig. If we need to edit our pivots, we can click on the 3rd tab here in the modifier panel under Hierarchy and choose Effect Pivot Only. Now the pivots are shown here in these blue, red, and green wireframe arrows, and we can move those pivots around as we need. In 3ds Max, objects can be organized by name, class, color, and layer. For example, pressing H or clicking on the Select from Scene button up here on the main toolbar allows us to select objects by name. In this case, what we're seeing is that I've got objects displayed by class, just showing lights, and those are organized by name. I'll click on Display All, and there's all of the objects in the scene. The icon to the left of the object denotes its class, lights, geometry, and so forth, and then they're organized by name. Right-clicking on the name bar then allows me to sort them in ascending or descending order, configure the columns I'm seeing, and replace the column with something else. We can also display children if there are any. For example, in a rig we might see multiple objects that parent up to one master, and we can display this by clicking on Display and displaying children or influences, for example. These objects are all colored in their wireframe, and we can tell what color it is by selecting an object. Right now the ticket booth has all of its wireframes set to a light green. I'll pick this floor piece again, and we can see that Flooring Main Center has a green for its wire. Clicking on that object color allows me to set it, and here's a 3ds Max palette I'm using. I can even add custom colors if I'd like. Organization is a big deal, because in any given scene we may end up with thousands of different objects that compose it. We can organize, and we should organize, by name, class, color, and layer, so that we can find things easily for things like relighting or parenting. Our layers are accessible here by clicking on the Manage Layers button. And right now we can see that everything is on the default layer 0. What layers let us do is hide, freeze, and change the properties for multiple objects at once. For example, clicking on Hide on layer 0 hides everything in the scene. Freezing means that I can see it, but I can't touch it. I can also affect the properties by right-clicking on that layer and choosing Layer Properties. And in here, for example, I can say, Don't show frozen in gray, click OK, and then freeze everything. With a good grasp of navigating around the scene, we should also look at the project structure that 3ds Max works in. I'll click on the Max icon in the top left of the screen. And in here, I'll choose Manage and Set Project Folder. 3ds Max works in a project structure where there's a master project we can set and move if we need, and subfolders in it. Right now I'm in My Documents, 3ds Max, which is the default project created when Max installs. In there are folders for different pieces, such as archives and autoback or autosaves. Export, for when we're exporting out objects to other formats. All the scenes should reside in the Scenes folder, and scene assets such as textures go in Scene Assets, and this has subfolders in it as well for images, animations, photometric lighting, and sounds, for example. When we render out files, they go into Render Output. And finally, previews that will generate in a view from a camera, for example, can go in Previews. It's important to get organized in 3ds Max and stay in a project folder. This way Max knows where to look for things like textures and where to put rendered images. You can then take that folder around with you, moving it, for example, to a flash drive and onto another computer, setting the project and then opening the scene, and this way all the textures will show up. 3ds Max also has a terrifically flexible UI, and we can change this around by choosing Customize and Customize User Interface. We can save our user interface and take it with us if we'd like. I'll choose Customize User Interface, and I can change things like my hotkeys, my mouse and my mouse interaction, toolbars, creating new ones and adding to them, my quad menu, which is my right-click menu, and my top menus. I can even change the colors of things. For example, changing the color of the safe frame so I can see it better, or the viewport background. Whenever we're done changing things or customizing our view, we can save out that particular piece here by clicking Save. And when the whole user interface is saved, we can choose Customize and Save Custom UI Scheme, saving a UI scheme of actually fairly tiny files, and then going over to any other station of 3ds Max, loading our UI scheme and having all of our functionality with us. So when you're working in 3ds Max, stay organized. Work by name, class, color, group, and layer. And keep things where you can find any one of maybe thousands of objects easily. It'll help you along in managing your workflow. And stay in a project folder so that Max knows where to find all the different pieces that contribute to your scene and where to put the renderings. This way, you'll spend less time hunting around for things and more time making great images. 3ds Max has one of the best modeling tool sets around. To model an object, we create and then we modify geometry. For example, clicking on the Create tab and then choosing Box from the standard primitives under Geometry lets me click and drag a box in the scene. I'll click and drag for the base, release and drag for the height, and click to end. These are parametric objects, and I'll click on the Modifier tab on the command panel to see the length, width, and height. Choosing under Customize and Unit Setup shows me that I'm working in generic units, and my system units here are set to inches. So this box is 31 by 31 inches roughly and 50 tall. On any parametric object, editing parameters such as height, let's say clicking and dragging on this spinner here, increases the number of height segments. Alternately, I can reset a spinner back to its default lowest value by right-clicking on it. I'll put in some segments here and then bend this box. We can drop down on our modifier list, and we have dozens of modifiers to add on to an object. I'll choose Bend and then crank up the angle of the bend. We can see that the box is bending, and because this is a parametric modifier, Going back down to the box and changing the height, for example, shows that change rippling through the bend. I'll put an angle in here of 180 and bend that box into a complete arc. I can also change the bend axis. Here's X and Y. This may give me some odd results, as Z is the best axis to bend this on. Right-clicking on an object shows me a quad menu, and in this case, because I have the bend modifier selected, I've got top level, or the whole object, gizmo, this orange cage, and the center of the bend. I'll pick center, for example, press W to move, and slide the center of the bend around to affect how that object is bent. Right-clicking and choosing gizmo then lets me move the bend gizmo on the object, again to affect where that bend occurs. I'll right-click and pick top level. The hotkeys for this are 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 6 may be used on an editable poly, for example. This object is geometry, and I've created and then modified a box. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo the moving of that bend gizmo, and then convert it to an editable polygon by right-clicking, choosing Convert to and Editable Poly. We have a lot of different tools available. Over here on the Command panel, I've got my Modifier tab up, and I can see my sub-objects are available: Vertex, Edge, Border, Polygon, and Element. Picking Polygon, for example, and selecting a polygon shows that face in red. Then I can right-click, and here on my quad menu I've got Polygon Modeling Tools. I can extrude it or bevel it, for example, to create new geometry at the sub-object level. Right-clicking and choosing the dialog box next to one of these objects then pulls up the caddy. In this case, this is the caddy for bevel, and what it shows me is that I'm working on the group, and I can switch over to a local normal, or by polygon, and how far and how deep that bevel is. I'll crank up the height of that extrusion, and then decrease the size of the ends. This way I'm making points on that arch. In the caddy, clicking on the plus shows that transformation applied again, in this case producing some very odd results. Clicking on the check then accepts that transformation and exits the caddy. I'll turn on my graphite modeling ribbon by right-clicking next to the main toolbar and choosing Ribbon. The graphite modeling ribbon provides even more tools for modeling. Once that's on, I'll use the drop-down to show the full ribbon. And here I've got Modeling, Freeform, Selection, and Object Paint, and also Populate and People for crowd simulation. We can see I have a lot more modeling tools available, such as Swift Loop, for example. This lets me add interactively a loop along an object and size it where I need it. Different sub-objects have different modeling tools available. So keep in mind that there may be multiple tools available that will do the same thing. In addition to working in geometry, we can also work in splines. I'll press F to go to a front view and minimize my ribbon for now. Clicking on the Create tab and going under Shapes shows me splines, NURBS, curves, and extended splines. For example, I'll go to Extended Splines and make a wide flange shape. It's a common piece of structural steel. I'll click and drag out the size and increase the corner radius. Now I can take this shape and extrude it, using my modifier list to drop down and select Extrude. I'll hold Alt and the mouse wheel to spin around into an orthographic view, and then crank up the amount of this extrusion to make a steel beam. I'll press Z to zoom extents, and there's my steel beam, or maybe it's a column. Within this, then, I can drop back down to wide flange, and change the thickness, width, and height of my steel beam and the corner radius, and then also go back up to the extrusion and change the amount, or maybe the number of segments. In any spline object, the interpolation for us covers how many segments are in any particular curve. Here in the wide flange section, the interpolation defaults to 6 steps, which gives me 6 divisions or 7 facets over 90 degrees. If I right-click on that spinner to reduce it to 0, I get a crisp angle. Here's 1, for example, and I get 1 division. And increasing this number increases the number of divisions in there. This lets me adjust the smoothness of curves if I need, so I can reduce polygon count if I have to. I'll delete the extrude modifier, and there's my wide flange shape. I can also further modify this by converting it to an editable spline, And now I've got control by vertex, segment, or spline. For example, I'll go by segment and pick one of the top segments, and scroll down in the geometry section of the editable spline down to divide. I'll divide this with 2 sections, and now I have a center section that I can detach or move, for example. I'll take this and pull it up and change the shape of my steel beam. We can see in here also that there's an influence of those vertices on their adjacent segments, and that this faceting here is governed by the steps I'm using in my interpolation. Selecting vertices then, and right-clicking, shows me the type of vertex. Selecting a segment and right-clicking shows me the type of segment, a line or a curve, while pressing 1 for vertex and selecting a vertex and right-clicking shows me what type of vertex it is. Right now it's a Bezier corner vertex, and I can change how this affects its joining segments. Choosing corner, for example, gives me straight sides, and I'll make sure I do this to the others as well. Now I've got an even straight side on that part of my steel shape. We have a lot of control over splines, and we have sub-objects within them that we can use to further make shapes. We've got Boolean operations by spline. We can fillet and chamfer, for example. We can also connect ones together at open vertices, and choose by making first where that path resides. It's a very powerful spline modeling language that allows us a great deal of precision in making things. We can even take our splines and convert them straight to an editable poly if we need for flat shapes. Once we've made a shape, we can clone it if we need. I've made a box here that I'll click on to select, and I'll hold Shift while I drag on the red X-axis to move and clone. The Shift clone here is very powerful in 3ds Max, as it allows us to move, rotate, or scale an object, or sub-objects, and clone them on the fly. My clone options then show me copy, instance, and reference, with the number of copies available and the name. I'll choose instance, and make 2 copies, for example. Now I've got 3 cubes, and we can recognize that they're instances by the box name being in bold. When I change the parameters on 1 for an instance, they all change. A reference in 3ds Max is a different kind of clone. I'll click and drag on the red X-axis and make a couple copies. I'll change over to reference and click OK. Now what we can see here on the modifier list is that there's a separator denoting a reference above the box in bold. What this means is that below the reference line, this box is parametric as an instance. Let's put on, say, an editable poly, for example. Above that reference line then, this box functions as a copy, so extruding out the top of it then just extrudes that one. It's a very powerful way to work because it lets me have instanced basic objects and then change some of them to vary a look. The third type of clone then, a copy, means that each object has no relation to the other copies. Changing one only affects that one. A compound object in 3ds Max consists of one object that comes from 2 or more operands. I'll choose a Boolean, for example, and Boolean that sphere from that cube. I'll click Boolean, pick operand B, and select that cube, and then change which way they go. In this case, going B from A in a subtraction takes the sphere out of that cube. I can extract these if I need, or choose a different result such as union or intersection. Compounds are very powerful, especially when we need things like scatter, to scatter multiple objects over a source, or pro-Boolean and pro-cutter, for example, allowing us to break up objects and quantify them if we need. This is useful also in visual effects work to pre-break an object. The modeling workflow in 3ds Max is a deep and powerful one. It's worth getting to know the different objects available and what we can do with them, as well as the features available for each kind of editable object, a mesh, poly, spline, and so on. Look into the graphite modeling ribbon, and also the modifier list, as there are dozens of possibilities available. Finally, look into the differences between instances, references, and copies, and how those show up in both the modifier list and what the objects actually do with each other in the viewport. We can get richly detailed scenes made in no time, and be on our way to lighting and rendering easily. Cameras in 3ds Max allow us to position objects in the scene that view the scene as if they were still or motion picture cameras.
I'll go to Create and Cameras. And under my cameras, there's standard cameras available. Any additional cameras under there show up for different plugins or different rendering engines, for example. There's two types of cameras available, target and free. I'll click on free, go to a front view by pressing F, and click once to make a camera, right-clicking to stop creating. This camera then, in a perspective view, looks like, well, a movie camera. The icon appears to have film magazines and at least a rough lens on it. What we can also see in the camera is that the field of view is shown by this blue pyramid. With the camera selected, going to the modifier panel shows us camera-specific parameters. For example, the lenses are in millimeters and the field of view is in degrees. Picking a stock lens such as 35, for example, changes the field of view to 53.13 degrees. The difference between a free and a target camera is fairly straightforward. Choosing target camera, either in creation or in the camera type, creates a target object which we can select independently. Selecting the target allows us to rotate the camera to aim to it. The difference between the cameras is fairly straightforward. We can think of a free camera as a handheld camera, and a target camera as a dollied, jibbed, or craned camera. We can animate a camera just like any other object in 3ds Max. In this scene, the shot 001 camera animates into the entryway of the concourse in the train station, panning to the side, and then dollying forward, aiming at the ticket booth to show the revolving sign. I'll select the camera, and we can see here that this camera has a field of view of 64.011 degrees and a 28mm lens for a wider appearing scene. The lower the millimeter setting, or the wider the field of view in degrees, the deeper the scene seems. Switching, for example, to a 50 appears to flatten the scene out, as objects seem to get closer to the camera. In reality, the camera has not moved at all. Simply changing that lens or field of view makes things feel like there is more or less depth in them. Clipping planes allow us to stop what the camera sees if we need. When I turn on clipping planes, we can see that this camera defaults to a near of 1 inch and a far of 1,000. 1,000 inches doesn't quite include the back wall of the concourse, and so ends the view, which is particularly useful for compositing. Like any other object in 3ds Max, we can animate just about any parameter of this camera, including lens changes and clipping plane ranges. This lets us simulate a variety of cinematic effects such as a rack focus or focus pull onto an object. What differentiates cameras from any of the other views is that cameras are drawn as a camera view with a correct perspective. The orthographic views are isometric, and the perspective view is a drawn two-point perspective. A camera view then renders or sees things as if it was seen through a round camera lens. They're versatile ways to tell your story, so make sure you understand how the stock lenses and lenses in field of view work, and how to use your clipping planes to clip down how much the camera sees. Materials in 3ds Max let us create any range of surfaces for our models. We can create, as we see here in the train station, anything from rich patinaed leather through wood paneling, and even light surfaces that look like they're giving off light. I'll press M to pull up my slate material editor. The two material editors available depend on your preference and what you'd like to use. The slate material editor provides a node-based way to look at your materials in a graph. Choosing modes and compact material editor provides an older style material editor with sample materials and rollouts for all the properties. We can see on the left side in the material map browser that my available materials are standard and mental ray because I'm using the mental ray rendering engine in this scene. To create a material, I can either double-click on it or click and drag into the View 1. I'll drag over a standard material and double-click on it to show it in the Material Parameter Editor. The first thing we need to do with a material is choose the shader, dropping down under Shader Basic Parameters and choosing how this material reacts to light. Blinn for a smooth surface with a round highlight, and Isotropic for directional highlights such as those on wood or hair, for example. Metal or multi-layer for both metallic and layered highlights. Aura Nair blend shaders, for example, give us a blend shading model with an Aura Nair roughness under the surface, simulating rough surfaces with a little bit of gloss. Once we've chosen our material and our shader, we can then put in colors. Diffuse, the main color of the material in general light. The ambient color, the color of that material in shade or shadow. And the specular color, the color when that material is shiny. We can crank up the specular highlights and glossiness to tighten the highlights if we need. I'll double-click on the material to show that sample sphere bigger, and I can right-click on it if needed to pull up a preview window. This allows me to see that material in greater detail. I can even turn on a background to see that material previewed against something in case it needs to reflect. Our possibilities are almost limitless. It's really a question of what would we like to see on our models, and we can find a material that does that very well. .3dsmax supports a variety of rendering engines through its plug-in architecture. To set the renderer for a given scene, click on the Render Setup button, or press F10. The common parameters define how big the image is, and where it's going using the Files dialog. We can also choose a renderer in here if we need, and the other tabs here shown are unique to that particular rendering engine. I'll scroll down to the bottom and open the Assign Renderer dialog. We can see in this scene that I've assigned the NVIDIA Mental Ray rendering engine. Mental Ray, for example, supports global illumination. In the global illumination section, we can see that Mental Ray supports skylights and environment lighting, Final Gather for the bouncing and regathering of indirect lighting, global illumination for color bounce. And also as a part of this, it supports blurry reflections in our materials. The Renderer tab then describes how Mental Ray looks at things like anti-aliasing and ray tracing quality. Render elements for us in any rendering engine that supports them allows us to add composite passes where we can break apart an image into different parts such as diffuse, transparency, translucency, and so forth, and then reassemble that image sequence for artistic choice in fine-tuning compositing in another program such as Autodesk Composite. It affords a great deal of flexibility in a compositing pipeline to match into a background plate, for example. To switch rendering engines then, we'll jump back to the Assign Renderer rollout in the Common tab. Click on the Choose Renderer button and select a different renderer. Choosing the default scan line, for example, shows the change in the top tabs, and we can see here in Renderer, now we have a different way of looking at anti-aliasing. There's a ray tracing component and advanced lighting, which is an older method of considering the bounce of light in a scene. We have the option here, for example, of radiosity and the light tracer. It's important to get to know your rendering engines, as a rendering engine is an artistic choice to make in the scene. Different rendering engines give you different looks and can help you fine-tune your artistic vision depending on what you're after and what their capabilities are. Lighting can make or break a scene. Good lighting can save a mediocre model and make a really good model look top-notch. To make lights in 3ds Max, choose the Create tab on the Command panel. In the Create menu, go to Lights, and there's our default lights, photometrics. What this means is that these lights think and behave as if they were true light bulbs. Clicking on a free light, for example, and then clicking to create one in the scene, creates one light. When we go to the Modifier panel, we can see that this light thinks it is a D65 illuminant. In our templates then, we can choose different common bulbs, such as a 75 watt bulb, for example, and we can see in here that the light intensity and color changes. I'm using my realistic display and showing the lighting in the view. Lights can have shadows as an option, and we can turn them on by right-clicking and choosing Cast Shadows, for example. In this case, we're using shadow maps, where the shadow is approximating the natural fuzz of shadows. Switching these over to Ray Traced, for example, shows us shadows that are much crisper on the edges. Depending on the light type we choose and the color, we can get different looks in our lights. Additionally, we can vary the distribution of our photometrics to a spot, for example, to get a cone of light that we can then aim in the scene. In addition to our photometric lights, we have our standard lights. As opposed to the photometrics, which mimic true light bulbs, our standard lights are theatrical, that is, they are arbitrary as we set them. Creating a free spot, for example, in the scene gives me the same cone of light, but the parameters are different. I'll pull this light up, and we can see already that its intensity is much hotter than the photometric. Our standard lights then have an intensity given by a multiplier and a color, and also properties for decay and attenuation. In a light, decay is a rate of decreasing intensity of that light over distance. With a decay of none, this light is infinitely powerful, as far out as it goes. Switching that decay rate to inverse, for example, will fade out that light. In this case, twice the distance yields half the light. Switching over to inverse square is an inverse square relationship. Twice the distance yields 1/4 of the light. The difference between decay and attenuation is that one is a relative while the other is an absolute. Turning on the attenuation for a light, for example, and I'll swivel it over so it hits the sphere, means that this light can start at a certain point, and this light will end distinctly at the end of that far attenuation. Right now it's about 80 units out, and we can see here by this light blue sphere and where the light clips on the sphere here that that light is simply stopping at that point. Attenuation then puts an absolute range on a light, while decay is a relationship of intensity over distance. Within our spotlight, and in any light, there are parameters particular to that light. In this case, for a spotlight, for example, the hot spot is the area of the light where the intensity is 100%. The fall off for us then describes where that light fades off to 0% intensity. I'll back off this multiplier a little bit so we can see it. We can see here that that light is very intense in the middle and fades off nicely on the sides. In a render, this will become even more clear. In addition to our spotlights, we have direct lights. A direct light assumes that the rays run parallel and is useful for simulating the spotlight or a sunlight, for example. A direct light then shows up as a cylinder of light, again with a hot spot and fall off. In a directional light, changing under the directional parameters from hot spot and fall off to overshoot makes that light infinitely big. We can again choose shadow maps, ray trace shadows, and if we're in the Max Scanline renderer, area shadows. There's also particular shadows for mental ray, such as a mental ray shadow map. An omni gives us a point of light, radiating out from that omni a sphere of light in all directions. As with our other lights, this is governed by intensity and color and attenuation, and simply shadows are not. It's given that it is a ball of light, as we can consider it. In addition to our lights, we have our daylight system, and we can get to this by choosing Create, Systems, and Daylight. I'll add a logarithmic exposure control in my environment dialog when it suggests it. I'll click and drag out for the compass, and then release and drag for the daylight assembly head. What daylight gives us is a sun and a sky, and I'll click on the modifier panel to show this. It shows a sunlight and a sky, so that in our scene, in addition to having the directional light from the sun, we have the corresponding bounce of that sunlight through the sky. We can also switch this over from standard to mental ray if we need, choosing different parameters for our sun and sky. And changing over to the mental ray sun and sky asks if we'd like to put a physical sky shader in our environment map. When our mental ray rendering engine is on, we'll get our daylight with the corresponding correct blue bounce in the shadows. When we're managing our lights in the scene, selecting light, right-clicking, and choosing the dialog next to Light On pulls up the light lister. We can also get to this by choosing Tools and Light Lister. The light lister allows us to manipulate the properties of multiple lights at once. In this case, these lights are photometric, and I can see that I've got photometric light 2 selected. Its intensity is 1500, and there's its color, kind of a warm yellow. We've got the shadow type set to ray tracing, and because I'm using ray trace shadows, we just have a bias available. We can use this to adjust lights, including instance lights, where they'll show up in a drop-down list here. Remember that lighting can make or break a scene, and it's important to know how to get to the different lights, what they do, and the difference between practical lighting from a light bulb and theatrical lighting from our standard lights. We also need to know how to manipulate the shadows, change shadow type, and within each shadow, affect how that shadow looks. We should be able to change the intensity and color of a light, and also affect the decay and attenuation to make lights do exactly what we need them to do in a scene for a rendering.
When it comes to rigging, 3dsmax is probably one of the most versatile programs out there. There are 3 completely different, separate rigging systems, so you can pick whatever rig works best for your particular character or situation. We can start out here with Character Studio, choosing Create, and on the Creation tab in the Command panel, going out to Systems, and then Biped. When we click and drag to create a biped, we've got a humanoid figure, or at least the skeleton for one. In the biped then, going to the Motion tab and into Figure mode, we can adjust the structure, adding in things like tail links, for example. We can also add in toes and more fingers if we need. I'll add in fingers and finger links, so this guy has actually fully fleshed out hands to go with his tail. I can even add in an extra knee if we need. Changing those leg links to 4 to create a horse link. This allows me, if needed, a second knee, which can make for some very strange bending, but could suit the situation quite well. With a biped then, whichever part of it is selected, going into Figure mode then, shows us the height. In this case, instead of scaling up the biped, we can increase the overall height by pulling this up and down. The biped stays on the 0 plane, and its height is adjustable. Then to adjust this biped in Figure mode, let's say to scale out his shoulders, we can select them and press R for scale, scaling out those shoulder bones to give him broader shoulders. Once we're done getting the biped straight, we'll get out of Figure mode and we're ready to animate. We can animate a biped here in the key info, using tension, continuity, and bias, and setting keys on whatever part we need. The neat part with a biped is that it's made to animate, and a lot of the things that would be ordinarily time-consuming to set up are fairly straightforward. For example, selecting a hand and clicking and dragging to move it on the YZ axis gives us an IK limb. Clicking and dragging on the upper arm then, for example, produces an FK limb. It's as simple as clicking and dragging to select, and we don't have to think about turning off and on an IK. When we want to deal in standard bones, we can go to Create, and again under Systems, Bones. In 3dsmax, anything can be a bone, and that's one of the really neat parts about it. I'll make bones here, and for bones then, every bone I create creates a new bone after it as a child. I'll make a quick chain and right-click to stop creating. Zooming in shows me my bones as tapering boxes. If needed on bones, we can turn on side fins. What these let us do, making sure I have the right bone selected, is have fins on those bones for selection. This also allows us to size the skin to a particular model if we need, as the fins dictate the envelopes. Once we've got our bones laid out, we can put on things like inverse kinematic systems, selecting a top bone and choosing Animation, IK Solvers, and here's HI, or History Independent. I'll drag out to the end bone, and there's that IK goal. In this case, this HI Solver lets me click and drag to move that limb, so that, for example, when I take a foot, the rest of the leg goes with it. We've got different kind of solvers we can use, and they're recognizable by the goal here. We can resize that goal, change the swivel angle, and pick the start and end joints if we need, using the Motion tab's IK Solver rollouts. Once we've got a skeleton placed in our mesh, and we've skinned it to those bones, we can adjust the skin weights on our vertices. I've got here an example arm, and we can see here in the motion test that the bones folding up deform the arm, and when I need to sort out some skin weights. I'll click on Edit Envelopes, and then right-click and make sure Select Vertices is checked. I can use the Weight tool and Weight table to describe how those bones influence those vertices. I'll pull up my weight table and select some of the vertices up here at the elbow that are folding a little bit. Now what I can see is that vertex 25 and 26 are roughly split evenly in their influences. I can change this influence, for example, on vertex 25 from bone 1 up to 0.6, and we can see the drop in bone 2. Now when I scrub this animation forward, I get a little different deformation in the mesh. Increasing number 26 up to 0.6, for example, evens that out, and again I can see and hear a little less folding. I need to work over the skinning here,
and the Weight tool is also good for this. I'll right-click and choose Weight Tool dialog. And in this case, I can select vertices and adjust their weights in much the same way, increasing the influence here to 0.75, for example, on bone 1, which I have selected. Now I can see they stay a little more in place, and I've got other vertices to sort out. In skinning then, we need to make sure we take the time to sort out how those bones influence that mesh, so we avoid folding, and we've got the Weight tool and Weight table to help us with that. In rigging, constraints provide a valuable way to relate different objects together. They can complement bones or form the rig entirely, depending on what we need. In this scene, for example, I'll add a Look At constraint onto the box, asking it to look at that sphere. I'll choose Animation, Constraints, and Look At constraint, clicking and dragging from the box's pivot down at the base onto the sphere. We can see that the box reorients to now face that sphere based on where its pivot is. Wherever I select the sphere and move it to, the box rotates to follow. This is a rotation constraint. We can see this by selecting the box, and down here in the rotation controllers in our rotation list, here's our Look At constraint. Additionally, down in the rotation list, we can see that Look At constraint is the active constraint at a weight of 100%. The other cool part with constraints is that we can weight them, so we can share that rotation, position, scale, or other motion between constraints for subtle relationships. For example, we may have one object looking between two objects and interpolating that rotation. We may also have objects judging their position between two or more objects, and weighting which one is more prominent. We need to be able to identify our constraints by choosing the object where the constraint is, and going under Position, Rotation, or Scale to identify the active constraint, and also to see the target in some. For example, this Look At constraint has a target of Sphere 1 with a weight of 50%. We also need to be able to identify the axes that these use. In this case, this is looking on the x-axis. Flipping it over to the y, for example, changes the rotation of that box. Our constraints provide a versatile way to aid in rigging, and to make things like mechanical apparatus, for example, function smoothly, where we have relationships between different parts. It can also provide a way to help out bones, for example, adding customized functionality into a rig if we need. Animation in 3dsmax is a fairly giant topic on its own. It's one of the main things this program is really here for, to animate, to bring things to life. We'll start out by looking at an Art Deco train station I've constructed, and look at a few animated objects in it in order to get to know the things we need to know about animation. Right now I've got the ticket sign frame selected, and we can see as I scrub back and forth in the timeline here that the camera is animated as well as the sign spins. There's two different things going on. One, I've moved the camera. I've incorporated a pan as well as a dolly. And two, I've made the sign spin, and it seems to keep rotating in there. We'll start out then by looking at ways to get to the animation. How do we look at it, manipulate it, and view it? Down on my timeline here, I'm scrubbing the time slider. And we can see with that object selected, I've got a key at frame 0, and another key here, roughly we'll call it 96 or so. These are rotation keys, and I can tell that because they're green. Movement keys, or position, are in blue, and scale are in red. Other keys may show in black for other animated properties. We've also got some kind of controller applied, as I can see two keys here, but that sign seems to keep spinning. To get to animation then, we have a couple of ways. I can click on the Open Mini Curve Editor button down in the bottom left of my UI, and it pulls up this Mini Curve Editor, which I can even grab and fly off here as a separate window. I can go to Graph Editors and pull up the Curve Editor or the Dope Sheet. The Curve Editor is what we just saw, where function curves, or keys and tangents, are expressed as graphs, some relationship of either units, distance, rotation, and so forth on the left, and time down here on the bottom, in this case in frames. The Dope Sheet then shows animation as ticks on an X sheet or dope sheet, like a traditional animation studio would use. we can see here, when I select this object, that my animation is framed, and I'll make sure I get the right one. There's that sign again, and we can see that its animation is contained in these ticks. That is, I see the keys, but I don't see their handles and their tangents, the graphed relationship to each other. We can use the dope sheet then for grabbing large ranges of keys and copying and pasting or scaling them or moving them around. What we can do then is determine how an object animates, what happens before and after the keys, and what kind of controllers are on it. And I'll go to the Motion tab to look at controllers as an example. Right now, under Assign Controller, I can see in rotation it's using an Euler XYZ. And what's governing each of those X, Y, and Z rotations is a Bezier float. And that's my default here in 3dsmax. What it really means is slow in, slow out. I can add into these other rotations. If I needed the rotation to be derived from the rotation of another object, for example, and I can make a list and weight them if needed. We can do this by adding on other controllers, clicking on the Assign Controller button, making sure I have a property selected like rotation, and there's other things we can assign. For example, we can do a linear rotation, making that motion evenly interpolated between keys. We can make it look at or rotate to face something else. We can even stack in these rotations so that we have multiple rotations affecting one object. These are examples of controllers, and there's several ways to get to them, but we should understand that we're adding a controller on to control that animation in some way. I'll select the camera, Shot 1, by clicking on the viewport label Shot 1 and choosing Select Camera. We can see down on the timeline that I've got position keys at 0, 48, and 190 or 192. I can always zoom in closer, or find out what that key is by selecting it, right-clicking on it, and choosing one of those positions. Here's my X position, for example, and it shows me that keyframe 2 is at a time of 48 with a value of 1520, and that the in and out tangents right now are custom. We can fly out these buttons and choose different tangents for our keys. The tangents or handles affect how those frames are interpolated between keys. Slow, fast, stepped, linear, and so on. Remember that in 3dsmax we can animate anything we need, and understanding how to get to the animation, look at the keys and find the properties and change them, their values or their frames or their interpolation is really key. We can do this in any number of ways, from our mini curve editor to our graph editors, our dope sheet and curve editor, or even just on the timeline by picking that key. To change the interpolation then, I'll select a key and choose a new one. Tangents to auto, for example, flattens them out. I can choose tangents as spline, and I've got Bezier spline influence across that node. I can set them, for example, to fast, where that motion speeds in and then slows down as it interpolates away from that key. This is what gives character to an animation, so understanding how to get to them is very important for an animator. Lastly, as we saw on the sign, I can set the out-of-range types. I'll pick that sign frame again, and we can see here that the curve repeats on the Z rotation. That's the one that's actually animated. What I've done is to choose Edit and Controller, Out-of-Range Types. And here's my out-of-range types. Looping, cycling, a relative repeat, starting that rotation from, for example, the end of the last rotation. In this case, I've just got a simple loop, and I can tell this by those light blue buttons here, showing that they're pushed in for the in and out tangents, so I've applied the loop before and after the animation. This sign is simply on and will keep rotating forever in this animation. Make sure you understand your graph editors, how to get into keys, and manipulate them, and you'll go far in animation and add personality to your models. In 3dsmax, dynamics and soft body simulations for objects are handled through the Mass Effects physics engine. Additionally, we have cloth if we need cloth simulation, and hair and fur for, well, hair and fur on objects. I'll look at the Mass Effects engine first. I've got a very simple scene with a sphere and a box. For the sphere, I'm going to make it a soft body by choosing Animation, Mass Effects, Cloth, and Create mCloth. In this case, a cloth for us covers a variety of soft bodies. This is different from a rigid body, which I'll make the box. When I make this object an M cloth, we see choices in here such as using global gravity, capturing an initial state, and even in a physical fabric property, loading in our fabric properties if we need. We can adjust things like volume and enabling balloon behaviors if we want, and even self-collision if the object folds over on itself. I'll leave this alone at the default, and then select the box. Under Animation and Mass Effects, I'm going to make it a static rigid body. This way, a static rigid body such as the box won't fall with gravity. We have choices we can make in here when we're simulating. Are objects simply colliding, or are they reacting with forces in the scene, such as the gravity built in, or other forces we add in? Now I'll pull up the Mass Effects toolbar, right-clicking in the blank space next to the main toolbar, and choosing Mass Effects. In the Mass Effects toolbar, we have many of the same options, making things M-cloth, rigid bodies, and also our constraints and ragdolls. What I'll do is click on the Start Simulation button. The important thing in a simulation is to set it up and then simulate it over whatever number of frames you need. When I click play on this, it'll simulate these objects, and we can see here that this, well, now squishy ball, bounces down, caroms off the box, and flattens against the ground plane. We can get considerably more complex with our soft bodies, simulating things like explosions and bringing our M particles into particle flow for additional interaction between our Mass Effect objects and particles. This affords us a great degree of artistic flexibility when we can perform simulations on soft bodies for non-keyframe animation and get a natural motion if we need, as well as follow-through and a reaction with physical forces. Scripting in 3ds Max provides a unique and flexible way to customize your workflow and enhance how objects think, how they're created, how they function, and how they interact. We can get to our scripts by clicking on the Utilities tab on the command panel with the hammer icon. I'll open up Max Script, and down here in the Max Script we've got a couple of functions. We can open a script, clicking Open Script for example, and we can see here that this looks for a .ms or .mcr. .ms is a native Max script. These are actually just text files run in Max Script. We can also make a new script by clicking on New Script, and here in the Max Script editor we can choose different languages if we'd like. We can also use different tools, and we can even see some sample scripts. Here's a Geppetto macro for example, which was from Autodesk Labs and now actually helps run Populate. We can see in here that it's essentially a dot language, and we can record commands and even make things conditional if we need. There's a Max Script listener available down in the bottom left of the UI. Down here, what we can see is that I haven't run anything yet, and I haven't done anything to listen to, which would be shown here in pink. Selecting an object shows me it's not listening yet. I'll open the listener and choose Macro Recorder and Enable, and I have some tool switching available if needed. Now that this is enabled, when I select an object, we're going to see that Max Script. Here in this case, I deselected the cushion and all of its parts, and selected the floor main center. I can take this and save it as a script if I need, and then put it on a button, for example, on a custom quad menu or toolbar, and be able to run this selection as many times as I'd like. I can also use here, found under Max Script, the Visual Max Script Editor, and this provides a unique way to make custom windows and custom GUIs for things, or graphical user interfaces. We use it, for example, for rigs or complex object creation. And we can drag in all sorts of things like color pickers, checkboxes, drop-down lists, and even put in spinners and clocks. Max Script, then, provides a valuable way to extend 3ds Max, and a great way to really customize your workflow, to automate, save time, and make your animation truly unique. In 3ds Max, we have a lot of different ways of understanding where we are in relation to the world and what view we're seeing the scene with. Right now I'm in a camera view, shot 001. I'll press T for a top view, and Z to zoom extents, or maybe click and drag or scroll the mouse wheel back to see my view cube in the top right, as well as my whole scene framed. I'll press F3 for a wireframe to display this a little more clearly, as we're seeing really the roof of that train station. My view cube in the top right says I'm in the top view. By clicking and dragging on that view cube, on one of the corners I can arc rotate that scene around. Clicking on another view, such as front, rotates that view to an orthogonal front view. I can also click and drag on the steering wheel and rotate the whole piece around. And I've even got a compass, north, west, east, and south available, so we can align this if we need to a daylight direction. I'll click on the plus here on the viewport label, and under View Cube I've got different options available, whether I'm working in orthographic or perspective view, setting this view as a home or front for example, and resetting the front view to a true front if we need. We can even get in and configure this view cube here in the viewport configuration, looking at the size for example as large, and the opacity if we'd like to set, and also a closest view snap if we need. I'll hit apply, and we can see my view cube is much bigger now. As I click and drag to spin around, I've got different axes I can rotate on, and clicking on the home button returns back to my home perspective view. In addition to understanding where we are in 3ds Max using the view cube and steering wheels, we've got a lot of different ways of selecting objects, and it's important to understand what they are and what they do. I've got a window and crossing selection. A window selection means I have to select completely around an object to select it, whereas a crossing only need cross that object. Switching over to crossing and dragging a small marquee, or painting one actually in this example, paints in all of that baseboard. The second part of this, aside from choosing window and crossing in my selection, is to fly out that selection region and pick a different way of selecting. The default is rectangular, and I can also switch to circular, a polygonal lasso, and a freeform lasso. For example, a freeform lasso in window mode lets me select with really kind of any shape I care to draw this seating cluster. I have to go completely around it, but I can very organically define that selection region. This is different, for example, from a circular marquee, where I have to completely enclose that object within that marquee, and I end up grabbing some other things that are just on the top of the view. By knowing what your selection regions are, and switching between window and crossing, you can select anything in the scene easily, even painting a selection for a more organic selection of, let's say, tiny objects. I'll paint and use a crossing selection. Clicking and dragging to paint that selection lets me paint in things, and as long as my selection crosses those objects, they're selected. Use your selections as well as you can to select what you need. The faster you can select things means the faster you'll work, and understanding by looking at the view cube and steering wheels where we are in the scene and how we're viewing it lets us orient ourselves in our world and see things faster.